Namaste and good evening to all the participants. What a new way to connect with the medical fraternity. And this particular pandemic has taught us a new method to adopt if we want to continue medical education. And this is one step which TransAsia has also learned in last 6 weeks. And we continue to conduct scientific meets through these webinars. So on behalf of my company, TransAsia, which is #1 diagnostic company of India, I welcome all the participant, entire medical fraternity, all the doctors, clinicians, pathologists, microbiologists, immunologists, medical technologists, as well as entire healthcare supporting staff to this 7th webinar. We have been receiving an overwhelming response for last 6 weeks for each and every webinar which we have conducted. As of today, more than 8,500 doctors have participated in these meets, and they are not pertaining only to India, but we have doctors from Canada, from UK, from Italy, from Germany, from UAE, from Muscat, from Middle East, from Oman, from Thailand, Indonesia, from Bhutan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. Many countries have enrolled their registration on our seminar and really given us a very high level of respect. Thank you very much for attending my seminar. We have conducted in past many seminars, more than 1,500, but this is a very unique seminars method which we have adopted very recently due to the COVID-19 situations. And I'm very thankful to the medical fraternity who have helped us in conducting these seminars. And every time we try to bring national, as well as in past, we have also brought international faculty because of our access to these experts in field of lab medicine. Being a global company, TransAsia today has operations in 146 countries, and we have 15 places our own international offices. And that's how TransAsia has now become a global company. And with the help of our global partners, which is based at San Diego, Cal Biotech, which is a Arva group of companies, as well as with our partner in Italy and France, we are able to offer a new kit, which we have announced it in earlier seminars also. We have launched a COVID-19 IgG and IgM ELISA-based kit with 100% sensitivity and 100% specificity. And most so important that it is US FDA approved as well as CE mark. So that encourages all the quality doctors, quality hospitals, quality medical fraternity to adopt and accept and approve these kits. We have also approached ICMR and other various bodies in India to approve our products so that it can be made available. Very soon, maybe within 2 weeks of time, maybe less than that, we will be able to offer this kit to our Indian market. The best part is that this kit takes only 1 hour to perform the test, and it can be used on any system. There are a lot of ELISA readers which are available today in every hospital. This kit can be adopted on that. But the best part is this kit alone is not, but this kit is complemented with another new instrument which we have developed called LISA XL, which is a 6-plate ELISA reader, again Arva product, our own product, and this product will perform more than LISA XL will perform more than 100 tests per hour, which means almost 5,000 to 6,000 tests can be done in a day, and that is what is needed today, where government is demanding mass testing. A lot of patients have to be tested, and they are not finding out a very speedy model. This is the model which will fulfill their demands. Apart from that, our company is also at a very advanced stage to offer two more technology. One is a rapid test technology, and second is a RT-PCR, which will also be available very soon to this Indian market. I can only tell you, TransAsia at their own are playing this role of scientific activity. At the same time, we are continuing our support to all our customers, all the hospital, all the labs and diagnostic center by providing regular supply of reagents, regular supply of controls, calibrator. Our engineers are very much working in field day and night. Whenever they are on call, they are available to provide services so that instruments are put into order in this emergency of time. So we are very thankful to each one for supporting our staff and allowing them to work in the hospitals and laboratories to offer the best services. At last, but the most important thing is, we know the definition of doctors has totally changed in last 6 weeks. They are far, far above than what they are today with their degrees. They are very, very close for all of us like a god. And therefore, there is a saying, which is very common saying nowadays, that all the temples, all the churches, all the mosques, all the gurudwaras, all the other worship places are empty because the real god and goddesses, they are working 24/7 in hospitals. So thank you very much, all the doctors, all the medical fraternity for doing extraordinary job and saving our life. And enjoy the next seminar, which is a webinar on COVID-19. And to conduct that webinar, I invite my colleague, Dr. Avi Nahar. Dr. Avi Nahar is the strategic business unit head for hematology. He's a MD pathology, MBA, as well as PhD, with more than 8 years of experience of handling a large setup of SRL diagnostics. He has a special interest in hematology and he drives the entire business. So I will hand over the proceedings to Dr. Avi Nahar. Dr. Avi Nahar, please carry forward the next step. Thank you very much and namaste.
Thank you so much, sir. Namaste from India to all our participants and audiences across the globe. So we have so far learned about the various hematological, biochemical, and immunological indicators of COVID-19. But how do we interpret various ratios which are derived? For example, derived neutrophil lymphocytic ratio, lymphocytic monocytic ratio, platelet lymphocytic ratio, and also establish and validate the time lymphocyte model, the TML. So what are the theories behind lymphopenia? Can a routine test like urine analysis play a role in COVID-19 disease severity assessment? Let's find out as we welcome Dr. Seethalakshmi Subramanian from Bengaluru. She's MBBS, MD, and PhD, and she currently heads St. John's Laboratory Services and also is a professor and head of Department of Transfusion Medicine and Immunohematology at St. John's Medical College Hospital. She graduated from Bangalore Medical College and post-graduated from St. John's Medical College. For her work in coagulopathy in malignant solid tumors, she was awarded PhD from RGHS Karnataka. She is also a fellowship holder, FAI MER, in medical education in the year 2010 for her work on curricular revision for undergraduate medical students. And she is actively involved in medical education and also the co-convener of Nodal Center at St. John's Medical College itself. So she has been a lifetime achievement awardee by the Indian Society of Blood Transfusion and Immunohematology. And she's also winner of many awards like Ram Prasad Silver Plaque Oration Award, Linus Palm Award, and H.J. Nagulathamat Excellence in Teaching Award. So with this short introduction, I would now invite Dr. Seethalakshmi for conducting this session, and once again thank her for taking out time from her busy schedule. Over to you, Dr. Seethalakshmi, madam. Can you please take on the session now?
So good evening to all of you. At the outset, let me thank the management.
Madam, we cannot hear you. You need to on your audio, please. Switch on your audio, please. Madam, we cannot hear you.
Am I audible?
No, madam, not yet.
Hello? Hello?
Madam, I would request you to refresh the link, please. Refresh the link, please.
Right, I'll do that.
Madam, I'll request you to kindly log out and log in again, please.
Yeah, I'm just doing that.
We can hear you now, madam. We can hear you, please.
The screen is opening up. Yeah. Hello? Good evening. Am I audible? Good evening. Am I audible?
Yes, madam, you are audible.
Thank you. Yeah. So let me start with a note of thanks to Transasia as well as all the participants who have logged in to participate in this webinar. And it's been a great learning experience for me. As far as COVID-19 is concerned, our experiences, all of you will agree, is very limited. We are totally new to the whole scenario, and each day is a new experience. I am happy to be a part of a hospital which has a treatment center, an isolation ward, as well as ICU care facility for taking care of COVID-19 patients. Although the number of positives is, we are still in single digit number. So now when we talk about the disease from a laboratorian's point of view, the first question that came to my mind is, can the laboratory medicine contribute to counteract this virus? And if so, how? So in that context, if we look at it, the laboratories have an important role. One is to diagnose. And so we are already ready with a test, which is the RT-PCR to diagnose. But is that enough? What is our next role? Do we have a role to play in terms of staging the disease, in terms of prognostication, in terms of therapeutic monitoring? Yes, maybe we do have a role. As far as epidemiological surveillance is concerned, we did hear about the antibody testing kits that are being made available, and we look forward to having a kit soon in the Indian market. So we all understand that this virus, it starts...
Excuse me, madam. Sorry to interrupt you. Can you please switch on your video?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So the virus starts replicating in the upper respiratory tract, and most of the patients have very mild or no symptoms, except a small percentage who become severely ill. And the transmission of the virus continues to occur even at an early as well as in the later stages of the disease. And that's what makes it difficult for us to control this outbreak compared to the previous infections with the SARS viruses. So, hello, I think the slide is not moving, Ms. Dr. Avi. Yeah. So the clinical manifestations we are all very, very aware of. Fever, cough, respiratory tract symptoms are the commonest manifestations, but patients can go into what is called the ARDS, metabolic acidosis, coagulation dysfunction, and land up in an organ failure kind of a situation. As I mentioned earlier, most of them recover gradually without any sequelae, but there are some individuals, especially those who are elderly and those who are associated with comorbidity, land up in a severe disease state, leading to a high mortality rate, and that's what worries us all the time. So in that context, we are looking for efficient indicators of the disease, which can predict the severity, therapeutic response, and disease outcome. And this will help us plan appropriate treatment. Therefore, it's important for us to bring prognostic models into our practice, which will help us, one is understand the disease better, as well as manage our patients more effectively. So we all are aware that there are several risk factors. The clinical factors are well known. Now, if we look at laboratory parameters, quite a number of them are there. But how often, how are they used in the routine therapeutic monitoring of the patient is a big question. So why do we need these laboratory parameters? One is it's important for us to enable using lab parameters the risk stratification, guide certain interventional studies to target patients who are at an enhanced risk of developing severe disease, and at the same time optimize allocation of limited resources in the ongoing pandemic. So therefore, identification of parameters which are capable of discriminating between severe and non-severe cases or those at high or low risk of mortality will allow for improved clinical management. So when we look at routine tests, what I'm going to talk to you about is the application of routine tests like CBC, coagulation profile, the biochemical and immunological studies. And there have been several publications that are out already, and I have focused on certain studies that have retrospected and analyzed the time course of these parameters, which include hematological, biochemical, and immunological parameters of survivors versus non-survivors in order to obtain key indicators of disease progression and outcome, and which will help us provide guidance for subsequent clinical practice. So I being basically a hematopathologist, I will start with the hematological parameters, but at the same time, I would like to stress the fact that it's not that we can look at hematological parameters in isolation. They go hand in hand with other biochemical and immunological parameters, and that's what I'm going to take you through. So one important fact that we are well aware is the association of lymphopenia and leukopenia in these patients. Now, it's been adequately demonstrated that lymphopenia is associated with viremia and elevated liver enzymes, muscle enzymes, C-reactive proteins, and in severe patients, lymphopenia with high D-dimer values indicate poorer prognosis. So when we look at the association of lymphocytopenia with other hematological parameters, what comes to my mind is monocytosis. In several studies, it's been demonstrated the association of monocytosis with lymphopenia, and they've come out with a lymphocyte-monocyte ratio, which is abnormally low in patients with severe COVID disease. In addition, the neutrophil lymphocyte ratio was abnormally high because of low lymphocyte levels. Now, it is observed that platelet counts are near normal in most patients, and when there is a decline in platelet count, this is correlated with the increased severity of the disease, which correlates well with increased D-dimer levels. The association of increased platelet lymphocyte ratio with D-dimer levels is also well documented. So there are enough studies to show that the NLR and the PLR ratio, that is the neutrophil lymphocyte ratio and platelet lymphocyte ratio, are significantly higher than than normal healthy controls. There is enough literature to provide this. So this table that I have shown here is to demonstrate the change in the lymphocyte monocyte ratio, the NLR ratio, and the PLR ratio between patients with COVID and control subjects. So monitoring these changes during the clinical course of disease is simple, least expensive, and can be used as biomarkers to monitor the progression of the disease and the severity. Now let's look at, besides talking about these standard ratios, I would like to introduce you to a new ratio called derived NLR ratio. Now what is this DNLR? This basically is a ratio which is obtained by dividing the neutrophil count by the result of WBC count minus the neutrophil count. Now this seems to have an added value compared to the NLR ratio and the PLR ratio in patients with COVID infection. Now, another simple parameter that we fail to look at, but it's important to keep in mind, is eosinopenia. There are enough literature available that in addition to lymphopenia, eosinopenia is an early marker of COVID infection. And the mechanism of eosinopenia is because of the stress response of the acute liver injury caused by the virus, resulting in inhibition of the release of eosinophils from the bone marrow. Now, as you follow up these patients, an increase in eosinophil count during recovery stage is correlated well with radiological improvement. And it's also been demonstrated that a drug, lopinavir, which enhances this eosinophilic response, and this drug is used to treat these patients. Now, in a fever clinic which evaluated about 105 patients, eosinopenia is one of the earliest evidence that they looked at. So when they studied eosinopenia with the inclusion of lymphopenia, the sensitivity and specificity of these markers improved. So the combination of more than one parameter adds more value to the prognostic significance of this virus infection. Now let's look at what is called the time lymphocyte model. Now this particular model has been developed to study the course of the disease, the variation in the CBC parameters as the disease evolves. As we talked about earlier, lymphopenia is a well-documented marker. Now, besides this, we talk about timed lymphocyte model, where they looked at the lymphocytes at different time points. Now, when you look at the first time point, which is 10 to 12 days after the onset of symptom, and the second time point, which is about a week later, that is 17 to 19 days after the onset of symptom. Now, the basic cutoff is the lymphocyte percentage. Those who have a lymphocyte of greater than 20% at the first time point, which is 10 to 12 days after the onset of symptoms, are classified as moderate, and we are quite confident that they are going to recover quickly. But if you look at the lymphocyte percentage, and if it's less than 20%, they are initially classified as severe. Now, at the second point, which is 1 week later from the first point, if you identify a group of patients where their lymphocyte count is between 5 to 20%, that means they need a very close monitoring. And those patients who have lymphocyte of less than 5% are demonstrated to become critically ill with a high mortality rate. And those of them who have greater than 20%, we can be confident that they are already in the recovery mode. So that's the role of time lymphocyte model, which helps us to classify the disease as mild, severe, and moderate. Now, this particular table reflects the association of this time lymphocyte model that I spoke about just now in comparison with the clinical model. So it is well documented here that the critically ill group of patients based on the clinical guideline and the time lymphocyte model correlate very well. So also the severe ones as well as the moderate ones. So the correlation seems to be very good. Now this graph looks a bit complex, but I just want to draw your attention to the blue line here. Now this blue line depicts the lymphocyte count over a period of time between 2 and 3 weeks of patients who died because of the disease. And you will notice that the lymphocyte values are less than 5%. But look at the orange graph. Orange graph is those with moderate disease who have recovered, and the lymphocyte count is much higher. And you see that the black graph, which is in between the blue and the orange, are those who are characterized as severe disease, but with time the lymphocyte count improves and they seem to recover from the disease. So this is the role of time lymphocyte model. This is basically to depict what I already mentioned at 2 points of time, characterize them as moderate, severe, and critically ill based on the lymphocyte count. And what should draw our attention to is those who are less than 5%, and another category between 5 to 20%. Okay, so this will help us identify those individuals who are at high risk and who need intensive care treatment and who are associated with poor prognosis. Now, just a little bit about why we have lymphopenia in COVID patients. One theory is that the virus directly infects lymphocytes, causing lymphocyte death. The second postulation is that it destroys the lymphatic organs, causing lymphocyte depletion. And the third postulation is that the inflammatory cytokines cause lymphocyte apoptosis. And the last one is the inhibition of lymphocytes by metabolic molecules, especially when there is hyperlactic acidemia, which causes suppression of lymphocyte proliferation. So these are mechanisms of lymphopenia, and the time lymphocyte model that I just described could be easily applied in any setting to monitor the patients with COVID disease. Now, this particular study, which involved 32 patients, have demonstrated the role of high fluorescent lymphocytes. Now, we have had several papers in the context of the application of HFLC in several other viral disorders. One other is the COVID infection, where it is demonstrated to be significantly higher than the control groups. So now coming to risk stratification, can we use hematological parameters to stratify them and identify the risk? As I mentioned earlier, multiple parameters in combination seem to be more helpful than single parameters. Now this chart is complex. I've just broken it up into two to highlight what are the components of risk stratification. Now basically in the role of this particular model is that if you have a scenario where availability of the diagnostic test is very limited, you have to be very choosy in order to decide who are the patients who will go through the RT-PCR test. So basically there is a clinical screening, and this is followed by use of blood routine indices as well as radiological indices. And scores are assigned based on WBC score, lymphocyte, basophil, and platelet, and also radiological scoring. So the next step is to categorize them as low risk, high risk, or intermediate. If the two categories, the hematological and radiological score is less than 3, they only require observation. They don't need further testing. But those who are high risk, where A and B category, the score is greater than 3, are the suspect cases which need to undergo further nucleic acid detection testing. So this is one mechanism of stratifying the risk and classifying them as low, intermediate, and high, and then decide who are the patients who will require nucleic acid testing, especially in a resource-limited setting. Now, let's just briefly move on to the biochemical markers. Now, when we think of biochemical markers, several of them come to our mind, starting from CRP. Now, CRP can reflect the presence of the disease, the response to treatment, and the ultimate recovery. Now, this in association with other parameters like LDH, AST, ALT, which are evidences of liver injury, and creatine kinase, would contribute to predicting prognosis in patients with severe disease. And as we all well know, that these are the traditional markers of heart and liver dysfunction. Now, another marker that is proven to be of significance is the serum amyloid A, which is a biomarker which has been proved to be a marker of severity and prognosis in COVID. And this marker, in association with lymphocytes, CRP, and the ratio of serum amyloid and lymphocyte contributing to the help in categorizing the severity of the disease, has been published. Okay, so patients with serum amyloid A consistently trending down during the course of the disease seem to have a better prognosis than those where the values seem to rise. So the initial SAA level is positively correlated with the dynamic changes of radiological findings. And as I mentioned earlier, this in association with lymphocyte count and radiological finding has been proven to have value in monitoring the dynamic changes in patients with COVID disease and predict prognosis. So there are several other markers: lymphopenia, leukocytosis, the ALT, LDH, in association with ferritin and cardiac troponin. All of them contribute to the biochemical changes which can be used in predicting prognosis. Besides this, the inflammatory cytokines, which have been documented to cause the cytokine storm, is well known to be associated with disease severity in patients with COVID-19. Now, a little bit on immunological parameters. Now, we all know the complex interplay of this virus with the T cells, the NK cells, and the interferon production. So I'll just touch upon it briefly. So I spoke about the cytokine storm, the lymphopenia, and it's also documented that CD4 and CD8 positive T cells have been decreased consistently in all patients with COVID-19 infection in association with suppression of the production of interferon gamma by CD4 positive T cells, and this seems to correlate well with disease severity. And therefore, it's important for us to gain a deeper understanding of the factors that can affect the role of T lymphocytes in COVID infection. So as I mentioned earlier, there is a suppression of CD4, CD8, the interferon gamma, and but it's important to note that the B lymphocytes remain untouched. In fact, they are relatively increased because of the fall in the T lymphocytes. So the association of lymphopenia, hypoalbuminemia, high levels of liver enzymes, ferritin, CRP, and D-dimer, with high levels of interleukins and TNF-alpha have been documented in severe cases of patients with COVID. So this is a flow cytometric analysis of the T cells and NK cells. And in the next graph, I will show you the difference in the absolute number of T, B, and the NK cells between the moderate and the severe cases. You look, the blue one depicts the severe cases and the green one is the moderate cases. So it's very well depicted that the severe cases have much lower levels of CD4, CD8 positive T cells and the NK cells, as well as the interferon gamma production. So the lymphocyte score, D-dimers, the SOFA clinical score, presence of coronary artery disease, and age has been 5 important variables chosen in a multivariable logistic regression model. And as we have been talking about, the lymphocyte count was demonstrated to be the least on day 7 after the illness onset. And in those patients who improved during hospitalization, the lymphocyte count gradually increased, in contrast to lymphopenia, which further deteriorated in those category where patients were severe category of disease and the non-survivors. Yeah, so these were the parameters that I have spoken to you already, and all of them have been significantly proven to be high, and the values seem to increase with deterioration of illness. This particular graph depicts the temporal changes in the lab markers. So as I said, the dynamic changes that happen over the course of the disease, the first week, the second week, and the third week, it's important to monitor them, which will reflect the change. If you see here the difference between the survivors and the non-survivors that is depicted here for all the parameters, that's the D-dimer, the lymphocyte count, the interleukins, serum ferritin, as well as the HS troponin. So these values seem to increase further in those patients who deteriorate to become critically ill. So there are umpteen number of hematological and biochemical parameters that have been reflected to show changes in the disease. And this basically talks about the potential clinical and biological significance of each of the laboratory parameters. For example, if we talk about lymphopenia, the significance is the decreased immunological response to the virus. If I talk about thrombocytopenia, the consumption coagulopathy, when we look at procalcitonin as a marker, bacterial superinfection is what is responsible for this. So the mechanism and its significance is depicted in this table. I'm afraid that we may not be able to go into details, but basically the liver enzymes reflect liver injury, the kidney injury, the coagulation changes, and that's what each parameter reflects. And this is to show the statistical significance of the 191 patients that they have studied and the difference between each of these parameters between the two groups, the survivor and the non-survivor group that I spoke to you about just now. So this particular, the next 2-3 slides will give us an overview of the hematological parameters that has been well documented, the lymphopenia, the changes in the various indicators like the biochemical parameters between the ICU group and non-ICU group, the derived indices from the hematological parameters. And it's also noted that in patients who are in the ICU, as the deterioration of the disease progresses into the severe phase, the hemoglobin, the absolute monocyte count all tend to decrease, and there is significant neutrophilia. As I mentioned earlier, platelet count declines much later in the disease, unlike other viral infections where thrombocytopenia is a marker like in dengue fever. So I also spoke about the role of flow cytometry. The CD4-CD8 ratio is not reversed in this, unlike other viral infections like HIV and CMV. Now, the study showed that the older age group, the lymphopenia, raised LDH, were associated with more severe infections who required ICU care. Yeah, I also spoke about the newer parameters, which are not really no longer newer, the HFLC, which is well documented in literature, and some of the cell counters describe what is called the monocyte volume distribution width. And these are available in our newer analyzers, which can help us monitor the patients and identify those with worst clinical conditions. Now, for prognostication, as I mentioned, a combination of biochemical, hematological parameters will go a long way. I don't think I have to touch upon the role of prothrombin time and D-dimer, which has been discussed in great detail during the last seminar on COVID-associated coagulopathy. But I just want to draw your attention to one important aspect of this. We all have probably read enough about the thrombotic risk in these patients and the potential role of antithrombotic treatment. So which are those group of patients who deserve to be treated with low molecular weight heparin, and will laboratory parameters help us identify those group? And is it that independent of the clinical presentation, just the basis of laboratory changes which are suggestive of hypercoagulation may be an intriguing but premature fact until the interplay between hypercoagulation and SARS virus has been clarified. So there is a postulation where we could categorize these patients as severe and non-severe and look at D-dimer levels and see whether these are the patients who deserve to get treatment as a prophylaxis antithrombotic treatment, and will it help in improving their prognosis is something that we really need to closely look into in the context of hemostatic abnormalities associated with COVID infections. Now, the last part of this presentation, just a couple of slides on urinary abnormalities. Very often, laboratories don't focus too much on simple lab investigations like urine tests. Lot of emphasis is on hematological, immunological, and biochemical parameters. Therefore, I looked for evidences for urinary abnormalities. And I was happy to see enough literature on this. And this particular paper, which talks about urine analysis but not blood biochemistry to detect early renal impairment, drew my attention. And in this study of 178 patients, none of them had kidney dysfunction in terms of elevated serum creatinine. But of these 178 patients, 83 patients had abnormalities in urine analysis in the form of proteinuria, hematuria, and pyuria, although none of them had evidences of acute kidney injury. And it was also monitored that these patients who had abnormal urine analysis had worse outcome. So it's important that the abnormal urinary findings also correlated well with other laboratory parameters like which reflect injury to the hepatic system, inflammatory markers, and coagulation markers. So the results revealed in this study, the urine analysis is probably a better indicator of potential kidney impairment because the chemical tests seem to be normal. It's therefore recommended that we as laboratorians pay more attention to urine analysis to detect kidney impairment in patients with COVID disease, which may contribute to the prognostic significance. In another study which looked at evidences of renal impairment in patients with COVID-19, out of the 333 patients that they studied, 75% showed renal complications, like I mentioned, the proteinuria, hematuria, as well as the acute kidney injury. And when these patients were followed up, many of them recovered at the end of 3 weeks. But there were a significant group who had persistent renal impairment, and these patients had a higher mortality rate of 11.2% when compared to a mortality rate of 1% in those patients who did not have renal involvement. So adverse short-term outcomes of renal involvement seemed to be associated with severity of the disease. Although early renal abnormalities often resolve, intensive support and careful monitoring of severe or critical illness is appropriate for those with renal complications. So the incidence of AKI associated with proteinuria and hematuria were a significant number, and these patients were documented to belong to the critically ill category who required intensive care monitoring. Therefore, it's important for us to look for these renal abnormalities, the urinary abnormalities, which is shown to be associated with poor mortality. So having discussed the hematological, biochemical, and urinary parameters, of course, I did look for evidences of changes in the various effusion fluids, but there was not enough literature. I hope somebody will share their experiences as far as this is concerned. I would like to conclude by saying that the laboratory plays an important role, not only in just confirming the disease, but also monitoring the patients and also contribute to the epidemiological surveillance. It is necessary for us to identify potential risk factors in terms of laboratory parameters to predict disease progression and severity. Early and timely monitoring of the predictive indicators may also increase the efficiency of treatment and improve the prognosis. The laboratory abnormalities can be present at diagnosis. Patients presenting with severe disease have been noted to have more significant laboratory aberrations. So I would like to come back to the same question that I posed in the beginning of this presentation. Can laboratory tests help assess disease severity and predict risk of disease progression? I hope to a certain extent, at least, we have tried to answer this question. I'm not sure whether all of you are convinced, but I'm sure that lot more studies and literature will come out, and we will be benefiting from those publications and experiences that we are going to look forward to. So with this, I conclude the presentation, and I look forward to sharing experiences with each of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madam. It was a wonderful presentation, and it was very, very informative with a lot of information on many routine parameters which could be used for probably the early indication as well as for severity assessment. So thank you so much for that. We have got a couple of questions which were raised during your session. Although you have covered most of it, but I would still request you to kindly take few of them so that for the benefit of our audiences who joined little late,
sure,
they will get some benefit. So the first question was from Dr. Shruti. So she's asking, is the government of India allowing rapid cards to be used even in the non-institutional based labs?
As far as I know, not yet. Not
sure.
yet.
Yeah, that's right, madam, because the private labs are currently not allowed.
Yeah.
So similarly, the question from Dr. Tasneem was, can PCR be conducted by lab which does not have PCR or molecular biology testing under the scope of NABL?
Not yet. I
Not
think
yet.
the basic criteria is to have an NABL accreditation for the PCR testing. That's a first step towards getting approval for RT-PCR for COVID testing.
Sure. So coming from the NABL lead assessor, that actually validates the point. Thank you so much, madam. So another question from Dr. Tanima was, what is the cutoff of NLR ratio? And is it different in different age groups, or do we consider a same cutoff for all the age groups?
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting question, challenging question. Ready-made answers are not available. As she rightly pointed out, yes, the ratio has to be defined for each laboratory based on the analyzer that we are using, based on our control groups. We should have a control group and a study group. And it's also important because, as I mentioned, it's a dynamic parameter. So over the course of the disease, it's going to change. So, and definitely it's going to be different for different age groups because these values are different for children, for infants, and for older individuals.
Right. So we would also like to thank Dr. Prerna, who was also answering many questions on our behalf. So another question which Dr. Prerna is asking was, what is the experience of your institute in the body fluid cytology from pleural fluid and other fluids from the severe cases of COVID-19?
Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, my experiences are very limited. Okay, so we've not even crossed 2 digits as far as COVID positive patients are concerned. I'm still in single digit. But of course, yes, we have received body fluids from suspects as well as proven positive. It depends on several other contributing factors. It may not be that the patient has just a COVID-19 infection. There could be a superimposed bacterial infection. There could be other associated liver damage, renal complications, cardiac failure, and so on, which will contribute to the findings that we will see. So it's going to be a complex interplay of multiple factors. So it's too early for me to say that these are the significant findings in patients with COVID, because by the time patients develop effusions, they are already moved into a severe stage of the disease. And definitely at that stage, it's not just one factor contributing to the effusion. There are multiple factors. So we have to look at it in the clinical context and interpret them. So this is the answer that I can give as a broad-based answer. But if there is something more specific, I'll try and answer.
Great. That was very elaborative. We have another question from Dr. Sushanta, who has asked whether there is any association of or advantage of regions with endemic malarial parasite in this COVID infection, and what are the PS findings, peripheral smear findings in the blood samples of COVID-19?
Okay, as far as association of malaria is concerned, yes, several hypotheses have been put in, but none of us really know whether there is a definite association between malaria as well as susceptibility to COVID-19 infections are concerned. But there is literature, but concretely, I don't think we are ready to answer that question. Now, with regard to what are the peripheral smear findings, yes, patients can have significant leukopenia and lymphopenia, a relative neutrophilia initially, but if the patient deteriorates, the neutrophil count seems to increase. And at the early stages of infection, usually platelets are normal. That is one distinctive difference between this virus infection and the other viral infections, where thrombocytopenia is an early finding in other viral infections like dengue, HIV, CMV, and so on. Whereas in COVID-19 infections, platelets seem to remain normal for a major part of the disease. Only when they become critically ill, the platelets tend to decline. Another important finding is the presence of significant number of reactive lymphocytes, plasmacytoid lymphocytes, so monocytoid cells, increase in monocytes. These are important that we look for. It's important. Although the counts are low, it's important that we search for these. And definitely nowadays with the help of hematology analyzers, the scattergrams are there, which will help us add value to our findings.
Thank you. Thank you so much, madam. There's another question from Dr. Indranath. He's asking is interleukin 6 level is very diagnostic indicator and should it be used complementary to RT-PCR as well?
From the literature that I went through, as I mentioned very briefly during the presentation, it's not that very often when you look at an individual marker, their value is limited. So when we look at multiple variables in the context of each other, the value seems to be enhanced in predicting the disease as well as the severity and the prognosis. So if I have understood it right from the literature that I've gone through, interleukin 6 by itself, yes, has some value, no doubt, but its value is enhanced when we look at it in correlation with other parameters, other biochemical as well as hematological and immunological parameters. Its value is double fold, I would say, if you look at it in correlation with other parameters.
Thank you. Thank you for that. There's another question from Dr. Indranath as well, and also from Dr. Shilpi Saxena. So both of them are asking, so there is a role of urine analysis as we have understood from your presentation, but does the virus shed in the urine? And if at all it does, at what stage do we expect this shedding from the urine?
Yeah, this is again a challenging question. Yes, there is literature where they have done studies and looked and, detected viral RNA in urine as well as stool samples. It is there. But how long does it last? When exactly it is shed? And when are we confident? I don't think there is yet enough evidence to prove that. I think the more and more studies have to be done to answer this question clearly. I don't have a definite answer at this point of time.
Sure. Another one is from Dr. Aditi. As you said, eosinopenia is also a common finding. So is there a cutoff in absolute terms, because percentages are any which ways lower? So in absolute terms, what is the cutoff for eosinopenia?
Yeah, just like how we spoke about other CBC parameters, the lymphocytes, again, we will have to define our laboratory range and then establish a lower limit of the cutoff. Only then we'll be able to confidently say this is the cutoff when you should have a control group and patients with disease to compare the two groups. So as of now, we only look at the range, and anything less than the lower limit of normal, we document it as eosinopenia.
Yeah, so thank you so much for that. Another one is from Dr. Neelam, who has asked, and also many doctors are asking, so do all the patients suspected of COVID-19 undergo all the tests which you have mentioned as a preliminary investigation? And if at all there is an asymptomatic carrier, then, do they still show the similar findings as the confirmed or the symptomatic COVID patients?
Okay, this again a very interesting question, in the sense that definitely we are not going to do all tests in all patients. The request or the ordering or determining which test to be done in what case is largely dependent on the clinical presentation, right? So I would ask for certain biochemical tests, for example, which reflect liver damage. If the patient has some clinical indicator of hepatic injury, maybe he has a mild jaundice, or maybe he has right upper abdominal pain. So there should be some clinical pointer which will make us order for these tests. And not that all parameters are going to be done at one point of time. So depending on the stage of the disease, depending on the clinical evolution of the disease, various tests are going to be ordered for. And depending on the abnormality detected by the laboratory tests, we are going to monitor them. So I would like to say that all patients will not require all the tests that I spoke about, but definitely a basic CBC will already be done, always be done. A simple urine examination will be done. Maybe basic markers, biochemical markers, very basic tests will be routinely done. And depending on the nature of abnormality, both clinical and laboratory wise, we would take it to the next level, and that would lead us to doing the next level of testing, as in any other case. So
Sure.
Similar principles hold good for any other disease for that matter.
Yes, understood. We'll take a couple of more questions, madam, just 3 to 4 more. Thank you for your patience. We have very interesting questions coming from many doctors. So Dr. Shweta Puri, she's asking, are there any cases, who have been found to have vasculitis like syndrome in COVID-19? Is there any role of ANCA and the complement levels? And then, if at all it is, then do you have any experience of autopsy findings in such patients, if at all?
Okay. Yeah, I'm not a histopathologist who does autopsies, so definitely no autopsy experience. As far as features of vasculitis are concerned, yes, there is literature, a lot of literature coming out, but in my limited hospital experience in the context of COVID-19, not yet.
Right. There's another one from Dr. Somaya Jalu. Madam, she's asking, what is the relationship between erythrocytosis and hypoxia, especially in COVID-19?
Okay. I think greater the hypoxia, that means lower levels of oxygen. Naturally, the compensatory erythrocytosis will have to be there, just like in any other hypoxic situation. So the body tries to compensate by increasing the hematocrit and increased RBC counts. So same thing, but I have not seen enough literature in terms of erythrocytosis from what I have gone through. Maybe we have to look for more evidences which are documented. I'm just talking from my own understanding point of view, but I have to look up the literature. Whatever I went through did not have enough documentation of erythrocytosis.
Sure. Another one is from our audience from Italy. Dr. Dimitri is asking, could serum amyloid A be used as a non-specific diagnostic test for viral infections, or does it have any percentage of specificity for COVID-19 per se? And how do we then differentiate it from proteolysis?
Okay, that's a challenge, definitely. Because there are not many papers on utility of serum amyloid A, but there are a few papers which have come out. We'll have to do more studies to prove its specificity in the context of COVID. And we'll have to also have control groups with other infections. So there's not yet enough evidence to say that it's strongly associated with COVID, but that's one parameter that we could look at. But at least, if not being very specific, it can help us monitor the progression of disease. So the dynamic changes as the disease evolves. So you could look at monitoring this in terms of whether the values are decreasing, which will be an indicator that the patient is recovering from illness. At least from that point of view, we could use it as a parameter, if not being very specific in the context of COVID.
So we will take last 2 questions, madam. So once again, Dr. Shilpi Saxena, she's asking, what is the incidence of myocarditis and cardiac injury in ICU patient in terms of percentages, and do they actually cause, are they really the usual cause of death in severe complicated cases of COVID-19, or should we consider that ARDS and thromboembolism are more common than cardiac injury?
I'm afraid I don't think I have an answer ready-made, because yes, myocarditis is well documented. Naturally, ARDS, there's a lot of literature on that, but to very, confidently have an answer, I'm sorry, I don't.
No problem. Totally understand. Dr. Indranath is asking, what is the relation of IL-6? Is it correlating with the viral load? Say, for example, high fever patient or suspected patient with high fever, high viral load will have high IL-6. And are there macrophages found in suspected cases as well?
Yeah. As far as IL-6 is concerned, yes, there is enough literature to document that it's associated with the viremia, viral load. Higher the viral load, greater the viremia, greater the IL-6. That there is enough evidence. with regard to the second part, I didn't get the question clearly.
The macrophages, which you have already discussed in your peripheral smear findings. So thank you for that. One last one, madam. There is a question that if the antibody titer rises in the plasma, and since the talks about plasma therapy is going on, so is it that we are confident that with the rise of antibody titer, the plasma is non-infectious and we can safely use it for transfusion?
Not necessarily. It's very important for us to prove by RT-PCR that the virus is not detectable in the circulation. So it is important, I mean, in the swabs, by getting 2 negative tests done at a period of interval as proposed by ICMR. Sure. It is very important to demonstrate by testing that it is negative by RT-PCR. So one cannot assume that just because there is antibody in the circulation that patient is recovering and virus is no longer there and the patient is no longer infective. That is going to be difficult. So
sure. So with that, I think we, due to the constraint of time, and since madam is also very busy, we will have to stop the Q&A. But thank you once again to all our participants, and as per the feedback received, we will definitely release the digital certificates to all our participants. Thank you for taking out time, madam. We will now invite Mr. Ravi Kaushik from TransAsia Biomedicals. He is the CEO of our organization, and he would like to extend vote of thanks to you and to all our participants across the globe. And I would again thank every participant to be patient, and despite of a technical glitch, you all stayed on, and thank you for your patience. So over to you, Mr. Kaushik. Can we have Mr. Kaushik on video, please? So, yes, Mr. Kaushik has joined. We'll just take a couple of more minutes, madam. Thank you for your patience.
It is too much. Hello, and thank you. My name is Ravi Kaushik, and I am the CEO for TransAsia Biomedicals. So I wanted to thank you, Dr. Subramaniam, for a wonderful session today. We had a lot of participants. We had lots of doctors, great question and answers. And at this time of crisis, we really appreciate your precious time where you are spending your time to share your key knowledge, especially the lab parameters as indicators and prognostic markers. I think we had a fantastic discussion. I think there were 850 or 900 people who were very well benefited. We at TransAsia, in our own small way, are trying for the community to learn more and apply themselves more, and for us to be able to serve many more patients and get out of this crisis as much as possible. As we explained earlier, we are also offering the ELISA kit and the new ELISA machine, and hopefully we'll get the approval soon and be able to screen and monitor and test many patients so that we can get over this. So once again, from the bottom of our heart, our service engineers and our team remains committed to serving India, and salute doctors like you, and thank you all for your patience and your time, and we look forward to continuing this in the near future. Thank you, and namaste, Jai Hind.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
So thank you so much, and ladies and gentlemen, it was a wonderful session, and it was a pleasure to have you all. Till the time we meet next again from TransAsia, goodbye, God bless, Jai Hind, and namaste. Thank you so much.